Hi, it's great to be back in Ann Arbor. As Henry mentioned, our roots here as a family are pretty deep. I was a PhD student, got my PhD here in the early 90s. I also met my lovely wife here in Michigan. So there's lots of great things about Michigan. She had a PhD in psychology. And I'm happy to report that my daughter is just finishing her PhD in history here at the University of Michigan. So I don't know if we can get much bluer than that, at least from a graduate degree perspective. But it's always a pleasure to be back in Ann Arbor, where I feel very much at home. And it's great to see old friends like Henry, an opportunity to get up here and do that. So with that, I'd just like to say the talk I'm going to give today is not so much a straight up connected vehicle talk, although it absolutely applies, I think. As Henry mentioned, I wear a couple of hats at Noblis. They're probably relevant to the talk I'm about to give. So the first thing to know is that I've spent 35, I'm going to say 40 years in connected and automated vehicles. I was an IVHS scholar here with Con Chen and Bob Smith in the late 80s. That was how I got my funding to get to my degree here at the University of Michigan. But in the intervening 35 years, I've worked for one company, Noblis. We're a company of, as Henry mentioned before, about 2,200 engineers and scientists around the country. But we have a large group in D.C. supporting a number of our federal clients across the board, USDOT, through any of the ones you could actually name. We pretty much have supported them in a similar role doing research planning, research execution, prototyping, and emerging technology assessment. That is our job, essentially. That's what Noblis does in a great deal of... But what's interesting is that when you get to a topic like autonomy, it turns out that is so pervasive and such a transformational technology that not just one part of the government is interested in it, but almost every part of the government is interested in it. So in 2017, 2016 timeframe, we pulled together a number of the folks who were doing autonomy-related research across Noblis in multiple domains to develop a research center and start to pursue kinds of research that are related, essentially, fundamentally to all of the areas where autonomy might be deployed. In particular, as I get to in the talk, I promise I won't give the whole talk with the title slide up. We found that there was a ton of interest in decentralized self-organizing systems of machines. So that is a pervasive topic. So I'm going to try to talk about the application of some of the things that we have come up with as a research center, insights and potential ways of approaching systematically the approach of developing, designing, and engineering these systems in ways that potentially have not been able to be done before. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So that's kind of the point of departure for this talk. I promise it actually does apply to connected and automated vehicles, and we'll get more and more into that as we go through. But at some point, somebody throws up their hand and says, hey, this is a robotics talk. It'll get better, I promise, as we move through the slides. Okay? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and move to the first one here. Okay. I was supposed to be showing you that slide when I told you about Noblis. But in any case, let's go on to this slide here. All right. So one of the things I like to do, just in case, if you're in the room or attending online and you're wondering, do I really want to stay for all 40 minutes of this talk? I try to give the talk in 5 minutes to start, and then you can decide whether you're interested in it or not. So again, my talk in a nutshell here is about 5 key points in the so what statement. So the first thing is that, and these may seem rather obvious, is that if you're going to have a bunch of autonomous machines and self-organized systems, you need to deconflict their movement, all the tasks that they perform. But let's just stick with movement to make it a little bit simpler. So to do that, it requires prioritization. And that prioritization, if it's correctly generated, structured, and organized, can also do things like reveal value of the space, reveal value of the task to be performed. So that's the first generalized observation. Second one is that if we generate a maneuver transaction in which priority exists, so for example, vehicle A or machine A moves before vehicle B or machine B, if you establish priorities, it's meaningless unless there's trust, right? you can make a maneuver plan. If no one observes the maneuver plan, you don't have the ability to make a maneuver plan. You're back to just ad hoc autonomy, where the machines are trying to passively interact with each other, and there's no plan. It's not a planned interaction. It becomes something else. Okay, so the emphasis there on priority, right? So you can't have priority unless you have trust. You can't have a plan without priority. The third one is that if machines don't adhere, they deviate or they do adhere to the maneuver transaction, there should be some consequence for that happening, right? So if a machine very unreliably just go ahead and takes the space in the middle intersection, maneuvers in front of something else, wanders off, provides sensor information that is inaccurate, there needs to be some sort of consequence in the system for machines that do that. So in this case, we're going to talk about a concept about earned trust, right? So earned trust is a notion that you can systematically identify adherence to maneuver plans and execute them and manage trust scores for machines. So you can understand over time which machines can be trusted to do various things and which machines should not be trusted to do that. In machines of unfamiliar systems, it's also very important to have a notion of fault, right? Sometimes machines go awry and they cause crashes, accidents, shop floors, aircraft carrier decks, roadways, right? So now it should impact trust for sure. How much do we trust that machine in the future? Less. But also, what is the fault? How can we establish fault of that machine in the transaction, right? And value distribution, right? So remember we talked earlier before that prioritization reveals value for priority in the system, right? So if you damage that, if you deviate from it, then you're also you're destroying trust as well as destroying value in the system. So you have to have, so we posit that you need to have a mechanism that manages all these things simultaneously in the system: value distribution, trust, and fault. If you don't have all those things, you don't have an enforceable system of machines, right? All right. So down here in such a system, point number 4, earned trust, or sometimes declared as machine reputation, depends on where you live, and fault are two sides actually of the same value denominated coin, right? So they can be interchanged with each other, and the transactions that are made between machines can reflect both trust, fault, and value distribution simultaneously if they're designed that way. It doesn't happen without a design, without an engineering design. And last, if you design this system to do that, right? If you are designing a system for machine path planning, let's say, simple case, if you manage trust and you manage fault and you manage value distribution, you also already have made a system that works. So congratulations. But the next thing that is actually more important is that you've also designed an evolutionary ecosystem in which systematic rewards and risks are engaged. So you have an evolutionary pressure if it's done over many, many times. If you're doing 1 million intersection interactions, you're doing 100,000 shop floor redesigns, you're doing 800,000 replications of a single motion on an aircraft carrier deck. There's evolutionary pressure built into that because the machines that have low trust, high fault, will be removed from such a system or can be identified and removed from the system and replaced by something that works better. Okay. Great, Carl. So what? So what about this? So in our activity, this is where I would get back to vehicles here. The closer is based on some of the simulation work that we've done using some of these constructs, and they're relatively simple. So nothing as complicated as some of the things that like Henry was showing me out on the MC track right now. But if you build systems of self-organizing machines, and you apply these techniques to something like roadway intersection capacity or just roadway system capacity, our results indicate we could probably get at least 4 times the system productivity with no change to the right-of-way, in a system and a significant reduction in crashes, a 10-time reduction in roadway crashes and fatalities, 4 times the throughput, and in a system that actually pays for itself and doesn't rely on something like an externality like gas tax to fund it. So at least for the vehicle side, there's a there potentially. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. All right. So that's my whole talk. If you don't want to listen to it, please feel free online to just read email, or here you guys can do whatever you want to. But that's essentially what I'm walking through in detail, how we get to this statement down here. Okay. So I mentioned at Noblus and me in particular, I've always been interested in decentralized, self-organizing machine systems, which sounds kind of like a strange thing to be interested in, but they're really super interesting in general, especially when they're human machine systems. I left that one kind of out at the moment. But for right now, let's talk about the kinds of systems that we study specifically in the research center. Our focus is on, as you can see here, sort of collections of heterogeneous, autonomous, connected, self-organizing, non-adversarial machines and humans, these machines for right now, that have episodic ad hoc interaction. Okay? What do I mean by those terms? Okay, let's walk through them. First, autonomous and connected. Those are the simple ones. You guys are already experts in it, But for us, autonomy really means that they're capable of some rather imperfect capability of sensing the system around them and making decisions about what they're going to do. The second is that they're connected, right? We can't really design a system that includes transactions and maneuver path planning unless they can actually communicate with each other. Next is we recognize that the most interesting cases are heterogeneous in nature, right? So you look at the difference in the size of these vehicles, 18-wheelers, burrito bots. These are significantly different in their capability to sense, maneuver, and coordinate, right? But those are the most interesting systems, honestly, to take a look at. And I will just put a plug in here for heterogeneity, that for almost every use case we looked at, heterogeneity is a positive from a cybersecurity perspective, from an efficiency and from a safety perspective. When things are homogeneous and everything has the same base capability, then there are very strange results in the system where it's very unstable over time. You'd think it would be the opposite, but the heterogeneity provides more stability to the solution. I'll just leave when that's a separate talk, but there's something that we really find heterogeneity to be an interesting and positive attribute of these ad hoc systems. The next is that they are self-organizing and not adversarial. First thing, self-organizing means that there's not, the eye of Sauron is not at the top telling everybody what to do. That they have to make these plans together and execute separately without referring to the Deus Ex Machina overarching third party that directs action. And non-adversarial. So clearly for the traffic, we hope, the connected vehicle and automated vehicle space, we hope it's non-adversarial, where no machine in the system is actively trying to destroy the other machines in the system. There are different kinds of rules for those adversarials, but we're going to talk about non-adversarial ad hoc systems. And finally, this ad hoc interaction. Okay, so we are super interested in machines that have to interact with a collection of machines on an ad hoc basis, but they have routine types of activities that they perform, like, for example, maneuvering through an intersection. There's a huge population of potential machines, but there's only a small population in which they have to actually transact and earn and manage trust at any specific moment. Okay? But the nice thing about episodic transactions is that we can actually test, right? It's the beauty of episodic interaction is that every interaction is a moment to develop and build trust, or assign fault, or reduce trust and distribute value. Okay? So the good news, I suppose, here since there's going to be a talk at Umtree and City, is that this describes the connected automated vehicle space that has all of these attributes. All right. So now I'm going to just talk about some of the fundamentals about machine transactions. Before I get started here, I'm going to do a quick just raise of hands in the audience to make sure I'm on point. So at some point, I'm going to talk a fair amount about distributed ledger technology. Some people like to call it blockchain. So I would, for those folks who think that they would say that they're relatively familiar to expert in the application of DLT or blockchain, you can raise your hand. Okay, great information. Thank you very much. I'll come back to that topic later. As a sneak preview, why I asked that question, because when machines generate a transaction, there has to be an enforcement mechanism. The most effective and very low-cost mechanism to do that with the machines we define is using smart contracts that are built under distributed ledger technology. I'll explain more of that later. It's one thing to have a plan, but it's another thing to have enforceability. And the enforceability comes from a contracting mechanism that machines can use with each other. Okay. So that's a preview of a slide to come, but I just want to make sure we got it. I got to tailor how I describe this. All right. So now let's just get back to real basics. Negotiation over shared space. So we're going to leave the connected vehicles and the beautiful MC City facility behind for a moment. Just talk about a relatively simple scenario in one of our labs in Reston, Virginia. Okay. Here we have rovers of varying sizes, A, B, C, and D. Those circles indicate the position of rovers. They're rovers. They stay on the ground. They don't fly. They can imperfectly sense what's around them, but they are fully autonomous and they are connected. They have a series of instructions where they get rewards for completing paths that hit these various waypoints. So, for example, a little hard to see, but if you look at machine A, in this case, rover A, its current target waypoint is 2. It's supposed to go from the top down to the bottom. But all of the rovers in the system have similar kinds of instructions. But they're also obviously conflicting instructions, right? And then after they get to those waypoints, they have a whole circuit they're supposed to go through. Every time that they hit a waypoint or complete a circuit, they get a reward, essentially. That's how they're motivated, the machines. So each of these machines, even though we're looking at a top-down view, they don't have this collective vision, right? They're autonomous machine. There is no Eye of Sauron guiding them all. There's no hierarchical control, no UAV in the sky that tells them, no air traffic control telling them what to do. They're on their own to make this maneuver. They don't have a good map of the situation here. There's some obstacles. These gray items are obstacles, and they're supposed to hit the waypoints, move through the waypoints without hitting anybody else. That's the goal. Generate as much value as possible. That's the experiment. In this case, but they can't perceive everything. They can only perceive well locally what's going on. In this case, machine B is likely to create a local map that shows the chance of immediate collision path on a directly towards waypoint 4, but a high chance on a direct course towards waypoint 1 because of the presence of that obstacle. But they don't know where the other machines are in this particular case. Okay, very simple situation. All right, so in our construct, the first thing we do is like, okay, now that we assume that these guys are connected and wired up to each other, they can communicate. So the first thing we do, unconstrained path planning. Where can all the machines go if they assume that they're the only machine in the system? So now you can see the paths here that those machines generate, the rovers generate. So first, unconstrained path planning. They just kind of figure out where they'd like to go. But surprise, there's a fair amount of interest in maneuvering through the center of that network. So we can do conflict identification based on the unconstrained path planning. So in this case, we know that these particular rovers are not that great at sensing or moving precisely. So we predict there's likely going to be a collision if all those machines move through the center, all 3 of them, at the same time. Luckily, machine C, rover C, is just going to go around the edge. Great. So in this case, we can, over a 15-second horizon, we can make a plan, overlay the paths, identify points of conflict. This point of conflict is something that we now bring in the concept of priority. Somebody has to be able to take that space. You know, the basic thing to understand is that if 2 machines occupy the same space at the same time, we have a collision. That is not acceptable. That's not, we're trying to avoid that in path planning, right? So the only way to do this is to say nobody gets it. I suppose you could do path deconfliction by saying everyone has to avoid that spot. But a more intelligent, efficient, and safe way to do it is to say, all right, we'll figure out who can use it first, right? We'll establish priority, and there are lots of interesting ways that you can establish priority in the system. Somebody gets priority between A, B, or D. and other machines must yield. By definition, if you're not going to have a conflict, right? So priority can be determined in many ways. And, to use like the human legacy roadway example, you can have rules of the road, right? You can have like, if you all come to the intersection first, the one that's turning right goes first, right? But can you trust everybody to use those rules? Whatever. We have rules. Priority can be assigned a variety of ways, including by a third party. But we're throwing that out here, or by a traffic control system. We don't have those, right? One interesting way of determining priority is to have it just randomly assigned. That actually turns out to be relatively efficient. But the problem with random priority is it doesn't actually reveal value. So you just randomly say, okay, this person, this vehicle, for example, gets to go, but the police vehicle or the ambulance trying to carry somebody to the hospital doesn't get to go first. Hey, it's random. Good luck next time with that trip to the hospital. Okay, so there are problems with random priority, even though they generate relatively stable solutions. Two things. One is they can't really prioritize by value, but the second thing is that they don't reveal value. That's the other critical component. So if we don't make a decision, like here's a sort of a point, is that we have to engineer a solution here based on something. And if we don't engineer it, we still have a semi-engineered solution with implications for trust, fault, and value, right? So in this case, we've tried lots of different ways of allocating priority, and we find that the most efficient and highest value is to use a sealed bid auction. So they actually all negotiate over the space. So in this case, to get back to the point, here's I'm sorry, I'm going too far, a little bit on trust before we get back here. So a preview here is that we need some sort of systematic way to deconflict this. There are ways of establishing priority in the system, like I just talked about, but none of them work without trust. Okay, so now my next slide is like, we have to assume that we understand trust for any of these transactions to be made. So if a machine agrees to yield priority, but then simply fails to yield, then a collision is likely to occur. Again, that point I made in my preview talk. If you don't have trust, you don't have maneuver planning. It's all, you might as well throw it out the window. It's a free-for-all. But in a system where the machine adherence priority mechanism is unreliable, all machines will be required to move cautiously and ignore all signals of intent generated by other machines, right? So in that case, it's like people driving around, turning on their blinkers and their blinkers, turning on their windshield wipers, gesturing out the window. You have to ignore all of that, right? And maneuver. It's like when you're trying to leave a parking lot at the end of a football game, and all the rules, all the good rules of driving are thrown out the window, and it's every person for themselves trying to get out. And it's actually very dangerous. And it's such an example where the human legacy system, we have built-in trust into the system, where we interact with each other in the ways that we can, which is very limited, not like machines can do it. But when we strip that system from the controls and the legacy etiquettes, essentially, it all falls apart and becomes chaos. Machines are exactly the same way. If you take the machines and you strip out rules, you get chaos that looks exactly like everyone trying to exit the football game at the same time, and it's only it's the strongest survives kind of situation. But in these kinds of systems, the only kind of trust that has any value is earned trust. So what I will say here quickly is that machines come with specifications. They can do certain maneuvers, they can sense certain things, and if you just go by the spec sheet and you assume that machine always will perform to that level, you have a very brittle system that is prone to find out and generate a lot of crashes in it. Because real machines in lots of episodic encounters tend to decline over time because they're either not maintained well, they're maintained unevenly, they're occluded by some particular environmental aspect that day. Sometimes sensors just aren't working, all that kind of stuff. So in our experiments, it's absolutely true that the way the rovers were built and expected to perform is never how they actually perform after 100 episodic encounters. They always degrade to some degree, but they don't degrade uniformly, right? So this notion is who can we trust and when we need to be updating that, right? So trust for the machine on day one might be different than on day 100, which might be different on day 1,000 when it's just been maintained, or it might be very different when it actually be damaged on day 1,002. So this notion is that trust is earned over time, but also dynamic. Okay. So in this case, let's just say we're going to give it to A. How do we know that B is going to yield? Well, in this case, if B has successfully yielded in 1,000 previous episodic encounters, then I should feel pretty solid that they're going to do that. If B has never yielded before, then we have to make a plan that's different. All right, complicated slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about negotiated priority. So this is where I talked about there are lots of different ways of establishing priority in a system like this, but they have impacts downstream. You can't just decide what they are and say, I hope that works. When you make these decisions in these kinds of machine systems, you make implications for all sorts of things downstream. So again, back to my talk before, why do we have them bid against each other? The answer is because, number one, the things that have the highest priority, for example, the ambulance trying to get to the hospital, inherently will bid more in the system to do so and have more value and can use that to make sure they do get priority. And for the folks who are not so urgent or less urgent, or systematically at a lower tier, they can be allocated lower priority. So in this case, let's just say A is doing something like the ambulance case. So it accrues 32 points of value for reaching waypoint 2, which is the highest in this system. A little hard to see, but D is 24, B coming across as 8, C goes 16 to hit waypoint 3. So everybody know what a sealed bid auction is? Yeah, I've got a lot of nods in the room. I've got some head shakes. Okay, so sealed bid auction essentially says each of the machines makes a bid, one bid electronically. How much will you pay? What's the top bid you'd make in an auction to get priority, right? And so in this case, the bids are right there, 10, 7, 5, 3. It depends on the algorithm used by the machine, but it's generally related to the value of the waypoint, getting to the waypoint at a time where the value is highest. Anyway, essentially what happens is everybody puts their bids in, and then priority is awarded to the highest bidder, but at the price of the second highest bid plus one. That's a sealed bid auction. If you've ever played fantasy football or fantasy basketball, where you do drafts like DraftKings type stuff, that's an example of a sealed bid auction. You say how much you bid for those players, and you get them, rather than an auction where you literally, raising your paddle to buy something. But anyway, these sealed bid auctions, so-called Dutch auctions, are also super efficient from a computational standpoint. They require only one input, simple kind of calculation, priority can be awarded. They're fast than iterative methods. So in this case, the sealed bid auction results in the priority being awarded to machine A. Thumbs up, because it's got the highest bid. Other machines may replan, but the yielding machines now potentially could be entitled to some of that value, right? Because we just created value. We had a bid, we had an auction, right? Machine A bid 10. It was awarded priority for 7 units of value plus 1, 8. So now we just created something that didn't exist before. We created a value. What is that value associated? It's the value associated with that dynamic space, access to that dynamic space. So we just revealed something from an economics perspective about the value of that space. That did not occur. We didn't know at that time, but now we have this value. So we now know from willingness to pay that machine will pay 8 units to take it. The question is, who gets it, right? We created value, we revealed value, but now the question is, who does it get distributed to? So one of the obvious things is, well, maybe the machines that yielded should get some value for being good citizens, for yielding, and if they execute, if the maneuver plan executes as examples, as we've written, those machines should be rewarded. Not only did you, get a higher trust score, but also you get a little taste of the action, right? I'll come back to it, but at the same time, that value generation, the system does not run itself. That lab floor requires maintenance, right? So there are other entities around making that transaction work. But just to put it in your mind, we've just used something, a sealed bid auction, to reveal value. And an important thing about the system we design is who gets that value later. We'll come back to it, right? Because we just created it out of thin air. Value is created out of thin air. It's revealed about the value of that dynamic space. It's just like buying and selling a house in Ann Arbor. What is the value of that house? You never know until you put it on the market. What's the value of that square between 5 and 10 seconds? You never know until you have machines. Go ahead. Right. So at that point, some of the things that we for speed, because generally with the rovers on the floor, this is all done in 1/10 of a second. So generally, in those cases, we don't have rebidding, although you could have rebidding if you go fast enough. What we do is we assign randomly at that point. So because a little bit of randomness after prioritization still reveals the value, but you get the speed for random allocation. So if the policeman and the fire truck and the ambulance all come to the intersection at the same time, and they all have the same level of priority, we can randomly assign and say, all right, fine. We don't know. We can't know who really should have priorities. We're just going to assign it randomly and move forward. Okay. So that's just a preview of why is it important? Yeah, question here?
So all these systems, all the rovers, are they tweaked by the same independent work?
Great point. So in this case, the answer is no. And actually, each of these 4 rovers, I'll reveal later, have different performance characteristics. So they can sense differently, and they can.
What I mean by that is reward system based on speed. So if it is based on speed, then you would think all of them would be bit the highest, right? Because they are all trying to go far.
Oh, I see. Okay, so just to be clear, first off, these machines are heterogeneous. They have different top speeds, different acceleration, all that kind of stuff. Great. The points that they get for hitting those waypoints degrades over time. So they want to go as fast as they can to get there, right? They want to get there. It's kind of like the value of hitting the waypoint is 32 right now for the first 15 seconds, but then it declines over time. That's correct. But each machine is making their own individual adjustments, and they're making it sort of independently, right, from all the other ones. So they don't all get together and say hey, well, here are my bids. What do you think? Well, they don't negotiate in that way. It's a very efficient. One time they bid, priority is established, and we go on to the second round. I'll show you in a second. That's the way what happens in the next round. But there are multiple rounds of planning because now A has priority, great, but we have to still sort out what happens to the other machines. They all need plans to maneuver in that same 15 seconds. So in this case, what happens is that we do 4 rounds. It actually gets resolved. Who gets priority? In this case, B pays for priority over C and pays 4. Honestly, that's what that little hexagon means over there. So now we have a maneuver plan. And you can take a look at this. It still looks like there might be conflict, but you have to really look at the fine print. So again, this is what machines plan. I didn't actually make this plan. The machines plan it. Machine B makes a plan to advance very slowly, and 10 seconds later, B right there at the advance of the intersection. And A passes in front of it before it goes through, right? Because A doesn't need that space after 10 seconds. It's already through, right? So that dynamic space actually gets opened up in the auction planning, and so they actually plan and use it, right? So these kinds of maneuvers are, very much endemic to the way things work out. Ooh, look at that! I'm really using up my time. All right, I'm going to go faster now. You guys are picking it up. But anyway, so the plan is self-fully executed. Then we deconflicted the motion, we maximized the value of the motion, and we quantified the value of the space. So we've done 3 really great, awesome things here that we couldn't have done with a different way of establishing priority. Okay, but now comes the fact that we have to be able to enforce what's going on, right? So I won't give you the distributed ledger talk, but essentially the way they work, it's a shared ledger system. where you essentially put your amount, your essentially money on the line. You say, look, I will do all these things. The machines agree to a certain plan. If that plan falls apart, then no one gets paid. These kind of smart contracts are generally used for machine microtransactions all over the place. They don't always use blockchain. So don't say we're going to like burn down the Amazon rainforest with all these. There are also efficient ways of implementing DLT that doesn't involve mining things to death. Bitcoin does that, but not everything does. That's the last thing I'll say about DLT. It is an enforceable smart contract among the machines. So we can test and see whether or not those machines actually perform as executed, right? And all the members of the system are verifiers of their peers' abilities, right? So if you don't maneuver as expected, you get dinged. It's like a Yelp review. 1 star for your rover. It just almost hit me, right? So in this case, what I'm showing here is that there's machine A overshoots and wanders out into the intersection before it's supposed to be there, right? So rover B records that as a deviation at time. And rover A may also self-report like, oh, by the way, I'm out of position. But that if rover C had made a similar maneuver, nobody would have cared or seen. So it has to be an observable error, right? So this post hoc assessment, we can say, all right, so A deviated from the plan, and so everybody's able to actually execute the plan. We didn't have to the plan wasn't thrown in the trash. The plan could still be executed. It was a marginal error in execution. But the implications for trust are, well, A, in the future, we may not really want to trust A as much in terms of managing its speed through the intersection. And the implications for fault is, well, there were no real implications for fault. Nobody got hit. No one had to alter their plan. But if they did, we could have assigned this to A, right? We have very detailed information about trust and fault because A is clearly the entity that did not adhere to the plan. Okay, so here real quick, trust and fault. Trust is inherently prospective. How much should we trust rover A in the future when it makes a plan? Maybe we should make them buy a little bit more space when they make those transactions. We can't maneuver too closely to them because they might overshoot. It's inherently prospective. Fault is like when you get lawyers involved. It's inherently retrospective. Who is at fault? Who suffered by how much? All this can be built into the transaction, right? So if there is a collision, the value is of all the damage can be assigned to A. If it's something more minor, but it still disrupts the plan, all the value generated from the plan might be subtracted or debited to the account associated with machine A. In this case, where it's very minor, maybe nothing happens. Maybe there is no fault in this case. So insurance companies take a look. This is potentially a way for automated vehicles to assess fault. All right, so in this case, we're talking about economic and material harm from disrupting the plan, including this is where B actually hits A, right? In this case, I'm going to skip over because I'm running a little bit long here. But the point is, when we have more catastrophic results in the system, now we have a lot of detail. It's better than a black box. It's all the information we need to know about what did every machine say it was going to do, what did they actually do, and who was at fault, by how much. Okay, and next, particularly for Henry and the Center for Connected and Automated Transportation, infrastructure can also be a part of this play, right? Part of the transaction, because there may be some parts of the space that is hard to illuminate, or you want to make sure that there's a lot of map sharing and other things going on. So these particular entities are like infrastructure. We just put like a beacon right there on one of the obstacles. It can provide visual views. It can actually communicate to the vehicles, and it also can be a verifier, right? This role of a third-party verifier is important, right? Because rover A may say, I don't know, I think it was rover B's fault. Rover B might just say, well, it's hard to say. This independent third-party verification is important for assigning fault, so the camera can help. But the beauty of this is now that they're part of the system, right? When we talk about distributing value, Maybe the infrastructure itself could be part of the entity that is generated or allocated value in such a system, because we want those to be placed there. Unless there's an economic imperative for that to be placed in the system, it may never get placed there, right? So now we have an economic motivation to install cameras that illuminate space where collisions may or may likely occur. Even if it's not a collision, there's still value in that transaction that generates the value proposition, reveals the value of the real estate, the dynamic real estate. Okay, so that's a lot. What I'll just say is that I just walked you through essentially the Novus orchestrated autonomy concept, which is applied to all sorts of domains, including connected vehicles. So right now is an example of how would this work in a broader scheme, not just rovers on the floor of our lab, but potentially in a larger transactional network that looks at large systems of surface transportation. So in this case, we have users, verifiers, broadcasters of information. They make plans. Those plans are encoded by a trust consortium. These are the entities that make and enforce the smart contracts. And then they record them on the ledger so they can be seen by everybody. That's the role of the distributed ledger technology, is to provide a record for these transactions, to establish trust, to determine fault, and to distribute value. I'm going to skip this part about misbehavior detection for right now. It's also super kind of interesting and complicated how you can detect misbehavior in such a system. But I'm gonna pass on that because I realize I'm kind of running long, and I'm going to go to the so what slide here at the end. But I'm happy to talk about misbehavior detection if folks want to afterwards. All right. So what have I just described? I just described an engineered solution for multi-machine transactions where machines may be very unfamiliar with each other, but they have to trust each other, and that there has to be, and in which there are real consequences, and value is generated in a way that is unlike anything that we currently use to fund our roadway system, right? So in this case, the earn trucks mechanism that we have built in here has a lot of interesting attributes. One of the things I like about it in particular is that it reinforces good behavior among machines, right? Not just like, oh, whoops, it screwed up. Like there is an economic imperative for the machines to operate safely and effectively, and it discourages the bad behavior. It rewards safe and predictable behavior in the system. And in the short term, that's great because you do path planning with a lot more confidence. But longer term, again, I alluded to this in my early mini talk, it makes it so that machines that can't compete in the system are weeded out, right? And it may introduce new machines like little burrito bots that can exploit unused space and stay out of the way of the other bigger ones. We see this on shop floors all the time, where we can put little machines inside of these spaces that can exploit the space left over by the bigger, slower machines and be able to move smaller objects and do other kinds of tasks without reducing the efficiency of the bigger machines. Fault accounting discourages erratic behavior, and our infrastructure sensors and how we distribute I have a separate talk on this, how we distribute the value can help us to say, okay, how do we motivate the deployment of camera systems, infrastructure that helps keep people, keep machines safe, people and machines safe? How do we pay for the underlying infrastructure itself, the roadbed and all that kind of stuff? Well, part of the solution can be from these transactions, because we just generated a new revenue stream a new value stream that did not occur before, because we didn't establish priority systematically. All right. So what? I told you before, at least for the surface transportation thing, I think it's an important thing maybe to think through, because based on the way the rovers move and the way that they find new spaces and they dynamically reallocate space, they find new capacity in a system like lost capacity, essentially, or undiscovered capacity. The machines will work them out if we strip out the legacies of like striping, lights, shoulder lanes, all that kind of stuff. If you just use the right-of-way shoulder to shoulder in terms of all equivalent space, these machines will find very interesting ways to utilize them in ways that we don't actually expect. We see like almost those crazy looking flows in the system that are probably not viable for human drivers, but ways of reallocating space northbound, southbound, if there's directional traffic, that kind of stuff is pretty clear. And these machines can be programmed to be very safe, right? So you can manage the trade-off. So we have found that in the systems where we get the 4 times productivity, we also reduce the collisions by 10%, and we generate this value. Anyway, so that's essentially the whole talk. I think I'll stop there because I'm probably a little over, Henry, and I'll take questions. I'm sure. Well, I hope that there are a few questions.
Hello, Kyle. Thanks so much for this presentation, and I learned a lot from the trust part. Actually, I'm a host equal developer, and I learned a lot about the trust part. So my question from this view is, how trust is trust enough for autonomous vehicle drive? Because usually, when we give some scores to other cars, and they it is much faster than another one. But I'm not really sure if I can trust all the things. After that, I can drive through it.
Yes.
So how trust is met?
Right. So it's a great question. One of the problems we have currently with the way we have trust systems built for humans is that they're generally binary, either trusted or untrusted. And I think we try to transfer that onto machines. We find that to be actually really limiting. So this notion of how much can you trust any machine in the system should be, they carry their trust score with them, right? So a machine that is really good at maneuvering, like we have some of our rovers that are really good at maneuvering in like 1 centimeter spaces, right? So they can really have tight headways, so lateral and longitudinal, but their sensing is terrible, right? So their trust score is actually, it differs, right? So when they do the maneuver transaction, the maps that they draw when they're merged into a collective map are degraded versus the higher trust sensor systems from other machines that have higher sensing, but they're allocated maneuver paths that are associated with their capability to do so, right? So they buy very narrow pieces of dynamic space and leave a lot for everybody else because they're so good at maneuvering. Likewise, if you flip the coin, you say, well, there's a really good sensor system on a rover, but they maneuver all over the place, then, okay, we trust that their sensing is excellent. Those maps they contribute to the collective map is higher, but their maneuver space, they have to be allocated more space to get through. At some point, like there are a couple of machines in our little rover system, B and D. At first, without any trust, they won't pass directly across each other. But after about 100 iterations, they almost always do it because they learn from each other that their tolerances can be, that tolerance will work, but only for those 2 machines. And the other ones, A and D, can't be trusted to make those same kinds of maneuvers. So I guess the two answers to your question. One, trust is non-binary, it's multidimensional, and every machine has to carry its own trust score. You can't just trust everybody the same way. That's a really bad strategy because you have to trust at the lowest common denominator if that's the case. So for AVs in general, I would say every machine should carry a non-binary, multidimensional trust score with it so that you can make machine transactions relative to the real performance, not the lowest common denominator. Anyone else?
I have a question about it. Let's just make me think of, like a signalized, control intersections. So just if like, real life, there could be like a case, one of the pedestrians jump into that intersection and you set all the priorities from all parties from different directions. And do you have any insight from the system how we should take it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we actually do it. We take things, we throw obstacles into the arena for the rovers, right? And so the first thing that happens is all transactions are off. As soon as that object appears, the maneuver plan is canceled. They stop, or they stop and then they have to replan based on that. They make a new set of, but in this case, what's interesting is that because it's a dark object thrown into the system, there's no fault. It's like the no fault object. So we throw it in, but we don't ding anybody for breaking the maneuver plan because in this case, it was this dark object that caused the thing to, so we just reset. Nobody's trust is implicated. No one has allocated fault. And then they replan and go on from there. that thing may also move, like it's that dark object could also be moving around. And so they're all tracking it. And if they have to drop the plan, if it's no longer viable because they drop the plan again, no trust implication, no trust implications for anybody, and no fault. So I prefer, though, that pedestrians would be not a dark object in the system, but a participant. So we have done this with humans in there. Humans can also negotiate the same way, but they need to be interacted with differently. So the machines are very, very efficient. Humans, not so much. So you have to redesign the system where it's a combined human-machine interface. But humans can also demand priority or bid for priority in other ways with other machines and do the same kinds of interactions. And their trust and their fault allocations can also be allocated in the system. So we have done some prototypes with humans and machines teaming. The same processes kind of work, but what's different is that the humans have to be provided with a way of getting into the transaction. And we use like controllers to do that generally, to enter their bids and so forth. And the humans really slow things down, but they can be part of the solution. Anybody else?
I actually have a follow-up question on that.
Sure.
Related with mixed traffic flow. That, in the autonomous vehicle crossing the intersection situation, if there are other human involved, is that going to be possible with this?
Like a human driver?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is possible. Same kind of answer applies. So the human driver of the machine has to be presented with information and be able to allocate themselves, to the bid in the system. In some cases, that can be delegated to like an autonomous agent in the vehicle, even though it's not an autonomous vehicle. If you say, I need to get to the hospital, this is high priority, we got to get going, you just say, pay whatever we need to get priority. And then what's harder with it, what's possible for the humans is to say, and if you have like a backup camera on your car, right? So you have like the green lines, yellow lines, that shows you where to go. Same kind of thing can be shown to say, okay, here's your target path and your speed that we want you to go. And then just follow those directions in a forward-looking way to follow the path. So you don't have to know, the human driver doesn't have to understand the entire path plan to execute. They just need an indication of what it is, even if there's not striping or something on the ground to allow them to just maneuver. But that in the end is, and so you can have mixed systems, but you can't have mixed control. So you can't have this running and signals, because who's in charge? And they're not coordinated, right? So that's the problem. I think we love what this does for the machines on the floor. I think it sets a certain sort of interesting target long term, but at some point, the real killer is that you can't have two forms of control in the system. So it's either the decentralized control through negotiation, or it's the legacy, human-based stuff, and you can't have them both run in parallel.
Before I ask the next.
Sure.
For Stevens, we're working on an ePart autonomy project.
Yeah, I actually had a question on that.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll let you ask questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Greg Stevens. So that's probably the one on the slide, is probably not the first implementation scenario, right? Because there is all those legacy controllers. There are all the dark objects like the humans driving around that aren't part of the system. So we are looking at a depot, like a
Yeah, absolutely.
area where all participants, are monitored. They're all sort of part of the system, right? So do you see that as the first reasonable application for this, or are there other implementation scenarios that you
Right.
think are more interesting?
No, that's a great one. So we have looked at doing it like at distribution centers where multiple carriers are trying to come in to the fence line and they're trying to access gates, right? And they have to maneuver in spaces, and sometimes the trucks are too big to get in one location or other, and they have to get out of each other's way, and they need it for a certain time, and then they got to get out, but they're not friendly players. So they're competitors who are all using the same thing. So this is actually a really good application for that, because if you really have like a priority shipment that you need to get out and you want a particular loading dock or gate or something, then you can buy it, you can do it to the benefit potentially of your competitors, because they are allocated some of the that space that you are not using or asking for priority. And then again, it generates value, right? You just generated value. Now you can also build and deploy the system that actually manages that, including the people who do the transactions or the machines that do the transactions. So yeah, I think a depot is a great place to do it. We have looked at some non-civilian applications where it is similar kinds of things, where there are different types of entities in the system, allied but not from the same sphere of command. And it's also super interesting to have them work out negotiation among themselves without having to like do a phone call prioritization. It's the worst. Phone call prioritization takes way too long. The machines can just work it out and you read the rules. It happens much faster.
Yeah, we were looking more at the idea of having a central traffic control system, but this would provide an alternative.
It would provide an alternative, and I'd say it provides a very interesting side alternative in that it generates the value to support the system long term. Who pays for the third-party system that directs everybody to do something? And who should actually pay for it? The people that use it the most, the people that generate the most value from it. Right. So, and I think that's sort of the killer, this separation holistic, not so holistically, in this case, or just general roadway traffic between the facility provider and the facility user as being sort of two completely different entities that are actually supplied and economically rewarded in completely different ways. If you put them together, now you've got a system in which everybody the utilization of the system pays for itself and keeps it running. Like, you don't have to complain to the depot operator, like, why aren't you spending more on this? Well, if you've figured out economically how to do that right, the thing generates value associated with the value it itself is providing, as long as it gets a slice of the action. If it never gets a slice of the action, it'll always be 10 steps behind.
Good. Thank you. Very interesting.
I think there's a question online, it's very much related to
Okay.
the question, although we are community focused. Question is, maybe I have missed it. It's claimed that the proposal will lead to a road system that pays for itself. Can Carl elaborate on this point? Is there any theoretical proof that the road system can be self-managed? What's the intuition?
Right. So it's a great question. And also, thank you, because I'm not sure that a bunch of microtransactions at intersections and other places where priority needs to be established will generate enough revenue to pay for the entire system. So it is theoretical in nature for sure. However, and we don't know how much people would actually pay or automated vehicles might actually pay. So there are lots of unknowns, right? But at the same time, I feel like over-the-road charging is sort of an allegory to all this, right? But it's like a sledgehammer versus a scalpel in terms of determining value, right? How do we determine what it is, even in like the demand responsive tolling situations, right? Is it really revealing? It reveals something like related to traffic engineering, but not actual user desire, as well as precisely. So I feel like, yes, it's possible theoretically that it could help pay for itself. But I feel like if you tie compensation to externalities like fuel usage, then that's like a much worse model because it doesn't actually encourage anything, particularly in terms of efficiency and safety in the system. But you could design a system in which value is generated. Is it enough to support the whole system? That one I can't tell you about yet. But maybe in the next couple of years, I'll be able to do enough research to address that more carefully. At this point, we're looking mostly at these mechanics of doing it that has a promise potentially of paying for itself.
I think for economy, valet parking application will be great for this. It may not be for general road network, but for the starting point, these probably.
Yeah. Curb space management is another big application here that we can get started. But at the same time, there are lots of dynamically valuable space in a system that may be inaccurately allocated at the moment. So the point is that it may be that bits and pieces of the network start with this, and then it kind of grows into something bigger. That would be my estimation. And in the end, will it cause the whole system to be more efficient? I would hope, but I think it needs to have both the tactical level and a strategic level planning combined to make that happen. So, Henry, it's a great point. I think this is great at high concentrations, high value sections of the network that are not currently very well dynamically allocated. That's the place to start. And we'll see how far it takes us. And if we all get fired up about it, then potentially there's a level on top that could allocate at a system level. But we have not done that research yet. So it's kind of It's an exciting claim down here, but I'm afraid I don't have a ton to back it up.
Thank you, Carl. I think that's all the time we have. And so I want to thank Carl for taking time out of your business schedule to join us. So thank you very much.